So we'll start by generating an altruistic motivation for our time. So as is typical of this course, we try to focus on establishing the minds of refuge, bodhicitta, and faith. Understanding that faith or confidence is the foundation coming both from whatever direct experiences we ourselves have had, however brief, however transitory, of recognizing that afflicted states are able to be reduced, and that which is able to be reduced is able to be eliminated through continued effort. So the possibility arises for a mind completely free of afflicted states, like the mind of a Buddha. And also, the mind of confidence arises from reading the biographies, the stories of so many great masters over thousands of years who they themselves have engaged in that further practice, themselves achieved that result. And refuge then flows from the understanding that the Buddha and great masters like Lama Tsongkhapa, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa Rinpoche are examples of that process, and therefore their wisdom, their teachings are reliable, unmistaken, completely undeceptive, something that we can turn toward without hesitation. And we recognize that that path that's laid out by the Buddha, that is written down in the Lamrim, its purpose is to create more and more enlightened beings. And the value of becoming an enlightened being is to be of benefit to the countless ordinary sentient beings. So ultimately, our goal should be to become like that, to become of limitless benefit to sentient beings. So thinking in that way, we generate those minds of faith and refuge in bodhicitta. All right. So we would be beginning then today with day 346 in the text, unless maybe Cameron remembered her question from Monday, but if anybody else has any questions from previous material, we could address those. So on day 346, Lama Yeshe we've been looking at the selflessness of persons, the selflessness of one's own ego identity, and the concretized false ego identity that we layer on top of body and mind. And in day 346, Lamrim Year is a bit describing what it is that we're encouraged to do, this process of analyzing. Later on in the chapter, some of those more concrete steps will be outlined, but here it says, when we check up, when we analyze, suddenly this I disappears, this concrete I. So Lama Yeshe here is kind of talking about the difference, as we alluded to once or twice before, this difference that happens when we don't analyze, when we're just kind of going about, either, could be because we've never come across these teachings and we're not capable of, we've never thought about it, we've never analyzed, or we do have some familiarity, but our life is just so, really, again, the same as any other, any of the other ones of these realizations. It's easier to kind of not bring them to mind. It requires a deep level of familiarity, not just kind of a surface level of familiarity, but a really, really integrated understanding to be able, as we're going about our lives, to bring in to that experience, wisdom, realizing impermanence, or to think, oh, this person who was, said a rude thing, oh, they've been kind to me over beginningless past lives, and so I should, not, or to recollect the disadvantages of anger in that moment. All of these insights, for them really to be usable and accessible in the hectic day-to-day experiences, that's an incredibly deep level of integration and familiarization that is the result of a long-term meditation practice. But so he says, when we are relaxed and off guard, this thief, the thief of the false concrete I, advances on tiptoe, he says, like a demon ready to attack. And then he says, but if we chase him, he suddenly disappears as if swallowed up by the earth. So again, looking at this dichotomy between, just kind of bopping along and not really bringing, wisdom actively to bear on what's happening, then all of these concretized ideas are going to be asserting themselves. But then the moment, because these concretized ideas are wrong, they're not based in reality, then the moment that we shine the light of wisdom on it, it does disappear. The moment that you do, at least, at least in meditation, for now, when you do actually, for the origin, the basis of that false perception, it is unfindable. And so it, completely vanishes, and you're left with a groundlessness that is what remains, but you have to actually do the analysis. You have to actually, as it says, chase him. There's the analogy, like looking for this false view. And it says, our mind will go on cheating us until we finally catch it in the act. So this is why, our samsara is self-supporting, because ignorance is perfectly happy to abide in the mind until actively the effective antidote of wisdom, directly realizing emptiness, is able to be brought to bear, and then ignorance can be overcome. Because again, the good news is that ignorance depends upon falsity. It depends upon not being in contact with what's true, with what's valid. And the other good news is that the mind that we possess. It's not directly, it's sort of implied here, but the mind that we possess, the ordinary mind, the deluded mind, the afflicted mind, is sufficient to engage in that process. It's not like we need some, of course, um, to go all the way. Fully qualified calm abiding has to be developed in the mind, but even still, that can be developed. The mind doesn't have to qualitatively be something different. It's true, there are things that must be done, but that's kind of like saying, well, I have a kind of average, relatively average, healthy body, and I would like to be able to, you know, participate in a marathon. Um, that's totally doable, but that doesn't mean that there aren't steps that would have to be taken from the moment of deciding that you would like to actually being successful. Of course, the better news is that the mind isn't bound in the same way that the body is. The mind is freed, more free from the limitations of a body. But as some sort of analogy, um, you can, it isn't off limits to an ordinary body. Maybe, you're not necessarily going to win the marathon, but you can participate. You could complete a marathon, but you would have to train. You'd have to maybe look at your nutrition, you know, get guidance and engage in a process. And then at the end of that process, you could accomplish that result. Um, and this is the same is true of this spiritual path. We don't need a new kind of mind. We don't need some special kind of mind, even though the mind is presently afflicted, is presently deluded. Um, we can follow all of these steps and we will get that result. Whether it, how likely it is to all occur within a single human lifetime, there's certainly causes and conditions that are more challenging for that specific result. Um, but certainly it's still not impossible. Um, so, he says, meanwhile, up until this point, we shall continue, excuse me, to carry around a strong intuitive feeling of I and a vague notion that it exists somewhere. He says, probably in the body. The only way to arrest this fantasy again is to observe the object of our hallucination. He says, in this case, our own self, to examine it carefully and see what it really is. And then he says, we must somehow bring the object in question into clear focus for close inspection. And this is kind of something that we've addressed in the previous classes here, where we said, I think in the very first class, in this chapter, I said that the traditional advice is to, when you want to do this, when you want to very strongly cause this false I, this object of negation, to clearly arise in the mind so that you can look for it and so that you can observe that it isn't findable, that it isn't, you can't pinpoint why it's present in the mind. Excuse me. I just can't get rid of this cough that I've had for like a month. So, as I mentioned, the best way to do that is to think of a memory in which you experienced embarrassment or righteous indignation or some sort of fear. And then it's true in this commentary, he also says another effective technique is to deliberately evoke during meditation an emotional crisis in order to bring this feeling of I to the surface. This strikes me as a very advanced technique. I don't know that I've come across that. I mean, of course, this is Lama Yeshe. I'm not saying, I just think it is a very advanced technique. So I don't think it's commonly dispensed. And I don't know, so it might make evoking an emotional crisis seems quite intense to me. I mean, even the prior technique, I would, really can be, if it's so emotionally charged. I mean, of course, he says the meditator must be extremely alert if they're to capture this image before it disappears. Um, to grasp on to that really clear. So, what I would say, I mean, is if we're so distracted, we're so caught up in intense emotion, it might be really, we might not have that kind of clarity of mind. Of course, it could be that he's talking about maybe a practitioner who has fully qualified calm abiding at this stage. And for that person, maybe it's easier to kind of separate and to be more clinical and to kind of separate things. Um, but yeah, in general, that's kind of, in general, if you want the false I to be very, very vivid, then you do want to evoke a memory of embarrassment or righteous indignation or some fear. But I would say we do. My sense is that it's wise to be to pick something that's not going to cause you to like totally fall apart, you know, because that seems so, because that's also possible. I mean, like you wouldn't want to imagine the worst thing that's ever happened to you, like um okay. So any thoughts or questions so far?
Venerable, it seems as though in contemplating this way and just touching on it a little bit in meditation, that it's that response that is elicited in revisiting something emotional is very physical. I mean, to me, maybe it's very different for everybody else, but that's how it came across to me. And I thought, there's where I can recognize it almost. It's not as though some mental vision comes across. For me, it's a very physical thing. And then I can point at it and recognize it as such. And I just wonder if people who, I mean, you hear of people or you read about people who have had a very close brush with death and that it's changed their lives. Not whether it's whether they experience death or not, but it seems as though, again, it's very physical, and yet they've changed psychologically or emotionally or mentally as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can give advice about like what, whether there is or isn't something to look for when a person is doing this. I don't think I'm able to give that kind of advice. I don't know if there is, maybe there isn't even a wrong answer, because it, it probably, I mean, it, as a person progresses through deeper and deeper stages of meditation, for example, they'll probably be able to notice different aspects of what's arising, would be a guess that I would have. Um, so, and that's a natural process that's going to unfold for that person over the years of doing this again and again. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that those responses, like, as we were talking about last week, they're very powerful when the heartbeat increases and the respiration. That is a very loud signal, and it's, so I think definitely it makes a lot of sense, that that's what that would be the loudest kind of part of the experience. Because physiologically, whether we are, whether it makes sense to flee or fight, it is still kind of that system that's being activated. And there are logical changes, blood being shuttled in different places, and the muscles and everything is, um, uh, so yeah, I think that makes sense. For me, um, often it's kind of the feeling is that's quite strong is a sense of like distance from my surround, is like separation is gets very strong, like feeling like a sense of disconnection, feeling like just kind of a very myopic kind of view. um, so but yeah, I don't know that. I think whatever it is that does arise, that's what you work with, would be my guess. um,
Thank you.
so then on day 347, Lama Zopa now is going to kind of give us some insight to the process of the generation of this false um, sort of process of concretizing. And this, to me, if I'm tracking this as best I can, it seems like it's getting at the difference between the mind that exists, that is unstained, as we know, the process of achieving enlightenment, the process of shedding the afflicted states that are covering, that are kind of um, obscuring, the obscurations is what they call them, because the presence of the afflicted states is, encircling, is kind of clouding the clear light nature of mind. um, and so for us as ordinary sentient beings, those two things are still there. There is the clear light, nature of mind, and then there are the obscurations that are covering them. And once you rid the mind of every single, all trace of any of the obscurations, then you're just left with, so, but you're not creating something new. You're not making out, you're not like fabricating some totally new thing. It's just that for an ordinary sentient being, there's no choice but for mind and affliction to co-arise. But affliction is separable from mind, through effort, through action. And so you kind of have these two things, happening at once. And so it's sort of like, in a way, the actions of mind are just filtered through this layer of obscuration before they become manifest for an ordinary sentient being. So he says our normal life is totally like a dream, like a so the quotation is, um, the way that the I exists. So he means like genuinely, actually exists, is so subtle that for our, meaning just ordinary, normal sentient beings, for our hallucinating mind, of course, Lama is including himself in that category, but he's just being humble. Lama Zopa isn't, having these hallucinations, but we are. So he could have said your, but that would have been maybe a little bit rude. So he didn't say that. The way that the I exists is so subtle that for our hallucinating mind, it's like it does not exist. So So in a way too, he's getting at, the difference between how strong and how intense the concretized, the false I is in comparison with what is true and what is valid about the I, the combination, the aggregates, the combination of body and mind. So he says our normal life is totally like a dream, like a hallucination, like an illusion, like a mirage. By thinking about what really exists, we can understand the hallucination. He says, to summarize, the valid base, the aggregates, is there. So the aggregates are the body and mind connected, and that is the valid base. So I don't know if we formally talked about this idea of valid, but it come up a little bit. So a valid base is this topic in Buddhism is called Lamrim, um, where they talk about all of kind of the logic of how you it's just sort of where they go into definitions and they go into kind of logic and reasoning and so on, which is very important as a foundation if you want to achieve enlightenment, because achieving enlightenment, as we're seeing, is about replacing invalid cognition with valid cognition. So we do have to kind of understand the process of cognition. So a valid base, or you could say a conventionally valid base, is one really just is one in which people, for us, I mean, you could say that it would change depending on what kind of sentient being you're talking about, because different sentient beings, I mean, I don't know if that's necessary to go into, but different sentient beings have access to a different, their karma is different, the way that they're experiencing reality is different, and so you can't really say that it is a valid, that's why it's a conventionally valid base, because it's only a valid base for a particular type of sentient being. And I mean, it may even be, it's really even cultural, you could say, maybe not even every human would share every single valid base. You have to have this kind of, because it's really just agreement. It's really just, in our case, what's relevant is people, because we're people right now. So that's the framework that's relevant, the framework of hell beings and hungry ghosts. I mean, it's just not relevant for our purposes of achieving enlightenment, but still nonetheless true. Because they give the example, of water, for example, as and they talk about how for humans, and water, H2O, drinking water, we see it and we're like, yeah, that's something that I need to ingest to continue to live. But it's just kind of ordered. It's just kind of bland, but yeah, I need it, so I ingest it. They say that same exact substance for, I think, the pretas, the hungry ghosts, it appears like pus. It appears like dirty and filthy, and um, not something that they are able to, and that's a karmic appearance of the same substance. And for the desire realm gods, H2O, water, would appear like a divine nectar, and it would have the function of generating like bliss in, when they ingest it. So for a human, it's kind of one, talking about it and thinking about it in one way is a valid way of talking about it. But for the same thing, a desire realm god would talk about it and think about it validly in a different way. But so what's relevant is that it performs the function that the object that you are thinking about and talking about performs a function that all of the kind of similar sentient beings to you agree that it performs. Like if people that, person could have a mental illness. I think water is poison, and and they might have built up some story. But because 99.9% of, or 999% of humanity would disagree and would argue against that one person's mentally ill perspective, we we can say that water is healthy and nutritious and so on, and necessary, but also just kind of plain, not super amazing, which is why we tea, we make coffee, we make tea, and because we all kind of want to make it better. So he said if someone looked at water and they said it was an airplane, then again, 99.9999% of the rest of humanity would be like, well, no, an airplane is something that you can get in and you can fly to a different state, and then you get out of it and you're physically in a different state, like it performs a different function. And they would say, well, no, you're wrong. So you have to, the object that you're saying is a particular that you're labeling has to be able to perform a function that everyone kind of agrees is why we call it that and why we relate to it that way. We don't use I wouldn't use water to start a fire, right? We all know that, we all agree, you might use it to put out a fire, but you wouldn't use it to start a fire. If you tried to use it to start a fire, it wouldn't perform that function, so you couldn't validly call it fire, or validly call it materials that reliably start fires. But matches, you would be able to refer, validly performs that function reliably, repeatably, under a variety of contexts, and so so the body and mind is a valid base for the I, whereas a water bottle on your desk, you wouldn't say, well, that's me. That would be because that no one has that experience. A person might have that experience, but they would be having it because of something wrong with them. They would be ill, they would be mentally ill, they would be under the influence of maybe a drug. And so can have false perceptions, people can make mistakes, and really is what is accepted as true by almost everyone in terms of conventionally valid bases. That's really what Buddhism asserts, is how you know whether or not something is or is not a conventionally valid base is to ask a large number of people, and you go with whatever the vast majority have said, and then you're able to, even though there are outliers, you would say, well, is it a sickness, is it a drug induced something or other, why are they an outlier in that process? It doesn't deny that people have unusual views, but so the body and the mind, we know that for almost anyone, that's where they would point to when they would talk about themselves. So that's why the aggregates, the body and the mind, is a valid base and not something else. And also why airplanes are not bales of hay, and beds are not Ferraris and so on, because we all just kind of come together and we say this label can only be used validly when you're referencing an object that performs the function that you are ultimately actually talking about. And if it doesn't really perform that function, you can't validly say that that's what it is that you're talking about. So he says that, the aggregates do exist, the body and the mind. Those are genuine phenomena. And because of that, he says the thought of I arises. And here is where the difference between the mind that exists and the delusions that are afflicting the mind are kind of a separate but simultaneous process, because um, he says what does actually arise is the merely labeled I and the merely labeled action. And he says, depending on what the valid base does. So if the body is writing a letter, then writing a letter is the merely labeled action. So we are, he's saying that we are capable, and what we actually do in the first moment is to have an understanding of the I being merely labeled, existing only on the basis of imputation. Um, he says, in the first moment, the labeling thought merely imputes the I and the action. For instance, if the I is sitting, if sitting is the merely labeled action, there is firstly the merely labeled I, and then secondly, the merely labeled action, quote, sitting. Therefore, it is so subtle. The way the I exists is extremely subtle, and it has never existed the way we have always believed it to exist from birth, from beginningless rebirths, in fact. It is never the way that our mind projects it to be truly existent. The I that exists is extremely subtle. It is like it doesn't exist compared to how it appears to our normal hallucinated mind. This happens in the first moment. In the second moment, and I don't know how long a moment is, it might have a technical definition. They say that a single mind moment is 1/64th, I think, of a second. One finger snap, or 1/64th of a second. So maybe he's talking, I think it's 1/64th of a second. I'm not sure. They say, I think it's a finger snap or something. That could be what he means, is that in the first 1/64th of a second, we're capable of, having that thought. But I'm not sure. He says the word moment, um, and I don't know for sure if he's referencing an actual technical definition of the word moment. But he says in the second moment, when it appears back, he says it should appear back as merely labeled. It was just merely labeled by our mind, So again, he's talking about us. He's talking about ordinary deluded sentient beings. Um, it was merely labeled by mind a moment ago, so it should appear back to us like that. But that is not what happens, he says. It only appears back to the Buddhas as merely labeled, only to those beings who have no disturbing thought obscurations, for whom there is no trace of negative imprints at all. Only the enlightened beings, the Buddhas, apprehend it as merely labeled. Until that time, for us sentient beings, we have this hallucination of truly existing appearance because we've not yet ceased the negative imprints of the disturbing thought obscurations. So again, this is kind of, talking about we don't add anything to the mind when we become enlightened. We just eliminate as he's calling it, disturbing thought obscurations, but the afflictions, the delusions, the obstacles to the emotional the emotional afflictions, and then the obscurations to knowledge, or the yeah. Any thoughts or questions? So then in the next contemplation, day 348, the quotation from Lama Zopa, things do exist, but not inherently. This is the ultimate truth that we need to discover. So this again is talking about the, um, trying to rescue us from the extreme of nihilism, from negating too much. Because, we just said that the merely imputed I, for example, is not a problem. The merely imputed I isn't going to give rise to afflicted states, isn't going to give rise to hatred and all of these other afflicted states. So if we can just recognize and stay with the merely imputed I, then everything would be fine. Because there is a body, there is a mind, they are connected. That's all true. But we layer on top of the merely imputed I the false concretized I. That is what we grasp at. That is what we cherish. Self-grasping and self-cherishing, those two things that we've been talking a lot about over the different chapters. We don't grasp at and cherish the merely imputed I. It's the false concretized I. And so then all of these other afflictions and delusions follow on from grasping and cherishing the concretized I. But when we are engaging in this, we don't want to say, well, therefore, because he says it's true that compared to the false I, the merely imputed I is incredibly subtle, but it's still there. It does still exist. So Buddhism doesn't go far as to say that nothing is real. It's just to say that for us, our experience of things is a concretized perspective of everything that we experience, and that's not real. There is a subtle way of understanding things that we can arrive at through wisdom. So we said that in the commentary, it says our understanding of emptiness can only be considered correct if it helps us to understand subtle dependent arising and does not contradict it. If it contradicts dependent arising, if instead of supporting dependent arising, it leads us to the conclusion that there is no dependent arising, no existence, that means there is a mistake in our understanding. So then they give the example of a vase or a vase. He says that when we check and we see that there is no vase, that the top is not the vase, the neck is not the base, the belly is not the vase, the bottom is not the vase. If we conclude that there is no vase at all, this view of emptiness does not help us to see how the vase does exist. So it does exist as a dependent arising, as an object of knowledge that depends on a unique history of causes and conditions, a unique collection of parts, and a unique act of mental imputation or mental labeling. It does exist in that way, as that. But it doesn't exist as this thing that seems like totally separate from me with its own inherent essence, its own identity that is just broadcasting its vaseness to our mind, and we're just noticing the vaseness of vase. To refute how it does exist, the way in which it is an object of knowledge, but we need to just discard that concretized layer that we're adding on top of what's there. Unless our conclusion is understanding of dependent arising, the truth for the all-obscuring mind, conventional truth, we're led to a sense that there is no way, that is not. Our meditation leads to nihilism when we begin to make the big mistake and leave out the object to be refuted. He says, when we look for the vase that exists from the very beginning, we fail to touch the object of refutation, that which does not exist. So, again, so like with the I, for example, we're not trying to refute the merely labeled, the I that exists independence on causes and conditions and parts and the act of mental imputation. We're trying to, so and so again, here is kind of a mixed, analogy in a way, because this is talking now about the selflessness of phenomena, meaning things that are not the I. But so, you would have to try to think of or cause the concretized version of the vase to arise in the mind and then refute that, rather than trying to refute the merely labeled vase, which you're not trying to refute. You're fine with the idea that there is a merely labeled vase, just like we're fine with the idea that there's a merely labeled I. He says, so we can see these two things are not separable. Dependent arising and emptiness are not two separate phenomena. That is the middle way, neither nihilism nor eternalism. What is a dependent arising is empty of existing from its own side, being merely labeled by the mind. Nothing exists from its own side. And emptiness is a dependent arising. In that way, dependent arising and emptiness are unified. So because any given phenomena exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, its parts, and an act of mental imputation or an act of mental labeling. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. Because it exists in that way, it is empty of existing in a false way that would be inherent existence, that would be, an impossible, an imagined, a fantasized way of existing. It is empty of existing in the false, imagined, fantasized, concretized, inherent way, because it does validly exist as a dependent arising on the basis of causes and conditions, its parts, and an active act of mental labeling, mental imputation. So things only, exist then for mind possessors, for sentient beings. That's, you have to, humans are mind possessors. They cognize. Animals are mind possessors. They cognize. And even the desire realm gods, the hungry ghosts, they're all mind possessors. They're all cognizing. And so that's a necessary, they are all mentally imputing that which they're cognizing, and they're doing it in different ways, which is again why the same quote unquote thing, object, phenomena, can be cognized differently for different kinds of sentient beings. But there are no sentient beings who are not cognizing, who are not mind possessors, who are not engaging in acts of mental imputation. Any thoughts or questions?
I think somebody ought to transcribe all of this and make it into a book, a commentary from Venerable Dondrub. Really amazing. Just just amazing.
I don't think that would be particularly useful, but Um, so we do one more, I guess. Contemplation for today. Day, the next one. Day 349. Lama Zopa says, if the real I exists, it has to be either one with the aggregates or separate from them. So here, that's a little bit confusing because he's talking about here he's using real not to mean real. He's using real to mean false, which is so, I mean, he's using it to mean our sense of it. Our sense of it is like this is really me, like this is truly what I am, but that is false. So, which is different than talking about like the merely imputed I, which is how the I does exist. But anyway, so then in the commentary, it says, why is it wrong to feel that the I is some sort of independent entity existing by itself? That's how we perceive ourselves, as if there's, as we said, in the previous class, it isn't, for us, it isn't sufficient to just be happy with the fact that there is body and there is mind and they have a relationship. For us, we want to postulate a puppeteer. We want to postulate the phrasing that some people use, which is just, it's a cool word, like a little homunculus, which I like saying, like a little tiny eye, like in the heart, like, like a little, but, some, it's like a third thing, is the point, that we have this urge to postulate that there is something more than body and mind, which exists over and above and is independent of body and mind. And this is how concretizing kind of feels. Um, and it's the same whether it's the I or whether it's something else, um, like with a car, for example. A car is a very, very common, I mean, no, I guess I don't know what they used. They used a cart or something, 2000 years ago. But for us, car is very, so just the label of car arises when we see a car. We just say, oh, that's a car or a truck. um, we're not comfortable with the idea that there are thousands of parts, to that, and that each of those thousands of parts had, started out as ore in the ground or in a rubber tree, or, as a collection of chemicals that were heated and cooled and pressed. And um, we just say car, to the mind, and that's how we relate to it. And then we would, well, that's the front door of the car, that's the steering wheel of the car, that's the front left seat of the car, as if this concept of car is capable of being a possession of all of its parts, or it's a red car. Like the concept of car is in possession of the quality of being red, or even beautiful car, um, as if the car is in possession of the quality of being beautiful, or ugly, or what have you. And so we do that with with everything. That's what concretizing means, is that you give everything a third quality, a third thing. It's and again, as we've said, we can recognize that we're making a mistake when we think about it. We can recognize we have sufficient wisdom, that when we really sit down and think about it, we can say, well, why do I need to anything about the car other than its causes and conditions and its parts? And then the fact that we've all kind of agreed as a society, as a culture, that we need to be able to talk about cars, to make society work, and to, be like, you call somebody up and you say, well, I'm going to be in the red car, when I come and get you. Well, then they need to know how to. That's how we navigate the world, is through labels and without that, like, society couldn't function. But that's what's happening. Like, that's what's real about the situation. But that's more difficult than just turning off all of that active, um, analysis and just being like, yeah, like, as just in the earlier is like, when we're relaxed and we're not paying attention, like, yeah, just car out there. It's only when you actually bring wisdom to bear on the situation, then you're able to see, well, I don't need anything other than the parts, the causes and the conditions, the parts, and then the fact that we've all just decided that that's how we're going to talk about it. So he says, so he's asking the question, like, what's wrong with that? He says, if we approach this question carefully, the answer will eventually become clear. It's impossible to think of the I without also thinking in some way of either the body or the mind. Thus, if the I were truly independent and self-sufficient, it would either have to be exactly the same as the body and mind, existing in perfect oneness with them, or else be something totally separate and distinct from them. If we meditate on this well, we shall see that these are the only two possibilities. As we meditate on emptiness, we pass through several stages of insight. He says, first, we gain a clear view of how we conceive of our false I, the one that appears to exist independently. So this is, again, identifying the object of refutation that we talked about before, just causing that to become clear in the mind. Then, as we try to pinpoint this false I by checking into it, by seeing if it is one with or separate from body and mind, it begins to fade and eventually disappears. When we can no longer find this I, we will experience a profoundly empty feeling within, as if we had lost something precious. That's kind of the groundlessness that the word that I was kind of using. At this point, fear may arise because we no longer have our I to hold on to. If and when this happens, we must be on guard and not fall into the extreme of nihilistically denying everything. This is a dangerous mistake, he says. Rather, we should persevere in our meditation, and eventually a very subtle realization of emptiness will arise. We shall be able to discern the absolute true nature of I, its lack of independent existence, and yet fully appreciate that it has a phantom-like existence on the relative level of truth. So here, what part of what he's doing here is giving a way of negating the false I that arises by asking the question, well, this is part of how you get process of refutation once the false I is clearly identified. You would say, as he's saying, okay, my aggregates are only body and mind. I have no other aggregates. I have body and I have mind, and that's it. So if my experience of my false I is valid, then either it is something that exists one with, and so I guess he kind of said it in the same way that I'm going to say it. Well, so how I would describe it is to say, one, that there's three possibilities. One with the body, one with, well, four. If, and maybe maybe he'll explain this in more detail as we go on. But ultimately, there's four: one with the body, one with the mind, one with the body and the mind, or completely separate from body and mind. Those are the four places that when we are looking for the false I, we would look. We would say it has to be one with the body, one with the mind, one with the body and the mind together, or completely separate from body and mind. Um, and he's kind of condensing that into two here, but so yes, maybe we'll just leave it there today, kind of just for now, because that's how, when we look in more detail about how to refute the false I, the whole game is, Venerable Rabina, her analogy is like if you're 100% certain that you had your car keys, and you have a very clear memory of having them inside your bedroom, and you closed the door, and then you went to sleep, and then you woke up, and you have an undeniably clear memory that they were. So then that's all you have to do. You only have to look in that one room, because it can't be anywhere else. It can only be there. And so then you have to tear that room apart, maybe, which is what we're doing. We're tearing all of these rooms apart, all of these possible places. In Venerable Rabina's example, it's a bedroom. In what's valid about how you do this, it can only be one of those four things. It has to be one with the body, one with the mind, one with the body and the mind, or completely unrelated to body and mind. It could be any one of those four. Um, and then realizing emptiness is to very, very meticulously analyze each of those four places and recognize that after you've done that, just like after you've torn your bedroom apart, then, as long as you can be certain that, like, it's not possible that somebody else came in and stole them. And, I mean, you would conclude that you were wrong, that when you thought that you left them in your bedroom, you didn't actually, because they're not there. So that idea that you had, it was a very clear memory, yes, but it must be false. You must be misremembering. You must be, and that's what we're doing here. We're saying, I have this very clear sense of myself, and that's undeniably true. I do, in fact, have a very clear view of myself. But if I can recognize that that self is unfindable in any of the places that it could be, then I have to conclude that this view of myself is illusory. It's a false concept, just like a mistaken memory would be. So, it's not denying that you do have that view. It's just saying that view isn't based on anything valid. It's not based on anything that's true. So in the next classes, we'll look at how, the process of looking at all of those four places, and then to understand that although it is true that I have this experience, no one's denying that that's not what we are experiencing. We have to see that it isn't a valid perception, that it isn't something, just like that idea of, explaining the color green that we used before. We can, because there's a way of validly explaining it, we can say that conventionally it's true. But the one thing that I wanted to say that I wasn't sure that I said before is that the false I isn't true even conventionally. Whereas green is true conventionally, the false I is not true even conventionally. because there's no method of explaining how it arises. It's a pure fabrication. It's a pure illusion. Whereas the color of green is valid conventionally for certain sentient beings like us. Okay, but so we're out of time. Any thoughts or questions?
Did you say that those 4 elements will be covered in the future?
Yeah, I'm sure that I haven't read in detail all of the remaining, but yeah, he does go into how to refute the false eye. So,
Wonderful.
I mean, of course, as with all of these, you'll find very, very, lengthier, more detailed descriptions, of course, in the Lamrim, in various other longer treatises. But yeah, I mean, we're going to touch on it. Yeah. All right. So we'll end with dedication. So we bring to mind the altruistic motivation that we established in the beginning, and think that by having listened and contemplated in this way, we've actualized that motivation, which has generated positive energy in the mind. That positive energy will bring about a beneficial result, and we want that beneficial result to be spiritually meaningful, spiritually supportive. So think of the ways in which you are offering the fruit of your practice, the ways in which you are dedicating that positive energy as causes to bring about those spiritually meaningful and supportive results. Okay. So we meet again on Monday.